Are you ready for the final panel? Yeah? Can you bear talking about due diligence even more? There was somebody saying to me, can you please avoid the word due diligence during this panel? I was like, it's going to be quite difficult because it's a forum on due diligence, but we'll try to make this lively. So this particular session today is about the costs, not unimportant, of the due diligence and how that can be distributed amongst the various supply chain actors, including suppliers and buyers, and what kind of collaboration is possible to have a fair and equal distribution of the cost of compliance. My name is Joris Oldenziel, and I represent the Dutch National Contact Point for the OECD guidelines. Full transparency, I'm also the Executive Director of the International Accord on Health and Safety in the Textile and Garment Industry. So I, from that perspective, have also an interest. But today I represent the Dutch National Contact Point. Maybe just give you a bit of background, the Dutch National Contact Point is structured as an independent NCP, which means that there are 4 independent members, of which I am one. And the other 3 are representatives or have a background in different stakeholder backgrounds. And the 4 of us each have a place in the Dutch NCP. So I was asked by the OECD to chair this panel. I also would like to welcome the online participants. I understand that they can pose questions, and later at the end of the panel we can look at what questions are coming from the online participants. So also welcome to the online participants. There must be a camera somewhere. Why is this an important issue at the moment? Well, we all know, of course, that mandatory due diligence is on top of everyone's mind at the moment, with various initiatives in Germany, of course, already mandatory due diligence, but also at EU level. And with that, there are increasingly concerns and discussions about the costs of compliance to mandatory due diligence. This is actually twofold, because on the one hand, it's the cost of the actual compliance of inspections or audits, remediation. And on the other hand, of course, any costs related to implementing any improvements in, for example, fire and building safety, or labor rights, or human rights, or environmental issues. And so today's panel is about how can we make sure that the costs are not cascaded just to the suppliers, but that there is an equal distribution between brands and suppliers, and what kind of forms of collaboration do we have experience from, or are already existing, or should be developed in order to ensure that equal distribution. So we have a distinguished panel here today. I know that the gender balance is a little bit off. That's why we put you in the middle. So apologies for that. I would like to start with gentleman here, Michael Bright from PVH. Michael is also a steering committee member of the International Accord, and also on the board of the RMG Sustainability Council, which is a tripartite organization in Bangladesh, consisting of brands, trade unions, and manufacturers. So that is one of the examples of how brands and suppliers work together. So Michael, how do you see the distribution of costs reflected in the work that you do? And one thing that I would like to note before you start is that the International Court has a provision that says that brands shall negotiate commercial terms with their suppliers to make it financially feasible to remediate. So we would like to hear from you how you address that and how you see that reflected in the work that you do. Thanks.
Thank you, Joris, and good afternoon to everyone here, and good evening or good morning to those who are joining online. I'm obviously the most nervous person up here as the brand representative in a discussion about fair distribution of costs of compliance. And I was very clear, I'm happy to have the discussion, but I will not today be signing any documents. So look, I think if we look at the International Accord, the precursor to that being the Accord, and currently in Bangladesh, the implementing body being the RSC, I think that is a reasonable good example at a macro level in terms of, I think, fair distribution of costs. So essentially, since 2013, when the Accord was established, brands have paid approximately $70 million, 70, into the establishment of the Accord. The Accord, now the RMG, or the RSC, has about 230 staff, I think, last count, including 100 engineers, fire engineers, structural engineers, and electrical engineers. So essentially, the brands are bearing the cost of all of the safety auditing in the factories. Then it's the role of the factories themselves to actually pay for and manage the remediation. So if we look at it from a macro level, that's how I would say the costs are shared. I think there's also a provision within that, that in the event that there's an inability to pay for a safety risk, that there's a provision whereby a supplier can activate a clause in the Accord to seek financial assistance. And that meeting and that process is actually managed by the RSC, managed by the Accord. So the supplier doesn't have to go directly to the brand or brands in the factory. Rather, what they do is they raise it with the RSC Secretariat, and they're the ones that look at the financing, look at the safety requests, sit down with the brands in the factory and plot a way forward. I think the other thing I would say is that in my view, the collective leverage is key, right? So we can talk about individual brands all we want, but if we look at, for example, the complaints mechanism within the RSC and within the Accord before that, as a brand, if you get a complaint come in, and I'll make this overly simple because a lot of you know this already, but just to illustrate the point, a complaint comes into our office. We have to go out and investigate it. We have folks in the field, they go and investigate it. They produce a report, maybe bring in an external advisor. We go through the report, we check it with our general counsel's office, we make sure it's okay. We build out a corrective action plan, and then we have to go and either sell that to the supplier or convince the supplier to implement that. The Accord model now with the RSC, it actually flips that completely. So when a brand signed the Accord, and if we look at the Accord in 2013 or its precursor in 2018, what they basically did is they gave delegated authority to the Accord Secretariat in Bangladesh, now the RSC Secretariat, to go out, conduct the investigation and produce findings. And the brands had pre-agreed that whatever the Accord finds, all the brands within that factory will abide by it. So what actually happens then is that when a report comes out and when the Accord says, here is the remediation that we expect you to take based upon the finding of the engineers or based upon the finding of the investigators, it's very, very clear that it's in everyone's best interest that the supplier follows that. And there's not that much of a debate back and forward because it's based on an independent assessment. So I think the collective leverage and the transparency goes hand in hand as well with the cost sharing. So happy to pause there, Joris, and toss it back to you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks for indeed pointing to those two types of cost sharing issues. On the one hand, the investments made by the brands in the actual operations. So that's the compliance cost in terms of the inspections under the Accord and now the RSC. And on the other hand, the support for remediation where that is necessary and indicated by the suppliers. So now I would like to hear from a supplier, Mr. Anand Ajua, who is from Shahi Exports, a very big Indian producer with many different factories all over India. And we'd like to hear from you, how do you see the collaboration between buyers and suppliers, especially as it relates to due diligence implementation, and what's your experience, and if you have any sort of good examples of how that has been going on since this whole issue of due diligence sort of came to the shore.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So just a few words about Shahi in case I imagine most people don't know us. We're a large manufacturer based in India. We run about 50 factories across 9 different states, and these factories have over 100,000 full-time employees. So it's a large operation. We work with a lot of global brands and retailers. And in our sort of long history of manufacturing, we have developed a lot of close partnerships and close collaboration with brands and retailers. I think that because Shahi has many factories, we're also vertically integrated, so it provides an opportunity for our customers and us to pilot new ideas and work together on new initiatives. I think that our size has also, in some sense, increased or multiplied the costs of responsible business conduct in some ways. And, obviously the responsibility of due diligence. The factory setting, it's a time-intensive production environment. And so compliance can be timely, due diligence can, isn't always budgeted for when we're doing our costing. So that can present some challenges as you scale up, or even at a smaller scale. I think that the responsibility for due diligence for so many factories can also be difficult when you're working with a range of different customers and partners. So we have had to innovate. I think that the ways in which we've had the most success is when there's been multi-stakeholder kind of partnerships, close collaboration with obviously with our customers, but also in some cases, with NGOs or other organizations who can provide some expertise. And I can talk about some examples, a few that stand out. We recently partnered with H&M and IOM to develop a migration support center. A lot of our factories employ interstate migrant workers, and we recognize that they face some unique challenges. There was definitely some unique risks in kind of working with this population. So we set up this external center to provide support specifically to the migrant workers. And a lot of our, initiatives and approach come from understanding the challenges that they face in our factories and, by employing them, but also through talking to partners like H&M who have the global perspectives. But then, of course, IOM can kind of bring in this global expertise as well. We also recently piloted a project called YES, which is yarn ethically and sustainably sourced. It's a new project by the Responsible Sourcing Network. And again, this is the reason we are able to participate in this type of pilot is because we have a vertical operation. So we run our own textile mills as well. And the project is focused on how to avoid cotton produced with forced labor, which has become, a topic a lot of people are discussing. So this pilot was very successful. It helped us understand the risks in our sourcing and how to essentially develop frameworks to identify the risk, but also, now the next steps are working with our teams to see how we can actually close some of these gaps. And maybe the third example I could mention, comes from actually PVH, who's also one of our close partners. Anything critical I may say about brands is, I would say that they're maybe the outlier in many senses. Shahi and PVH have had a close relationship for a while. And one thing recently that they were able to do was they adopted the PACE program by Gap, which is a program, again, that we had piloted in its early stage. So we've been very proactive about rolling out this program, which is a soft skill training for female garment workers. So we've been a leader in that program. And when one of our other customers adopted it as well, I think it provided a lot of, value in the sense that, we could scale it up more easily across all our units. We could get a lot of support in continuing to roll it out. And, that's a great example of investing in proven solutions.
Thanks very much, Anand. And I think very interesting to hear not only how you are working together with brands as a key supplier in India, but also how you are doing your own due diligence. And so, as most of us know, due diligence is a concept that is an expectation for every company, regardless of the size or the volume that you have. And so there's the responsibility from the brands to exercise this due diligence throughout their supply chain. But at the same time, there's also the responsibility of the due diligence for you as a company. And so some of these examples show that you are quite actively working on that also yourself, and then together with some of the key brands that you mentioned. So that's thanks very much. So now we turn to Dr. Lian from Syntac. Do I say that correctly? Yeah, maybe you can let us know how you are working in the initiative, the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative, and what kind of recommendations you have coming from that initiative in terms of responsible purchasing practices and buyer-supplier collaboration, which will ultimately, with the aim to distribute fairly the cost of due diligence.
Thank you, Joris, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm from Syntac, China National Tax and Payroll Council, which is the national business association for tax-related government-related industries. And of course, I'm here not just represent CNTAC. I'm representing actually 14 and 15 business associations that forms this initiative of STTI. And let me start with a congratulation on our Indian friends. It's a very good example. It's a concrete progress. But on the other hand, it's also some kind of improvement at one point. And let's actually go back to the very emotional but powerful speech delivered by the I forgot her name, but the Bangladesh lady. Yeah, I think she was calling for systematic and also very sustained solution to this buyer and supplier relationship. And STTI was actually created to provide a collective solution to this biggest challenge in our supply chain. I would like to say that STTI is actually a baby of the COVID-19 pandemic. Back in 2020, early 2020, when at the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, suppliers, including China, from China, from Bangladesh and other countries, we actually witnessed a huge wave of order cancellation, as well as delayed payment. Yeah, you can imagine how this will actually impact the livelihood, labor rights, sustainability of the business along the supply chain, especially for the suppliers. So a group of business associations, including CNTAC here, and also our friends from Bangladesh, from Cambodia, Myanmar, Vietnam, we formed like 2016, we formed a alliance called the STAR Network, Sustainable Textile of Asian Region STAR Network. So we issued a joint statement in April 2020. It's entitled the joint statement on responsible purchase practices amid the COVID-19 crisis. It's released by 9 business associations from 6 Asian countries I just mentioned. We actually call on all global business to uphold and honor their commitment to labor rights, social responsibilities, and sustainable supply chains, end of quote. So we know that the foundation of the underlying logic and the foundation of the supply chain face a huge challenge at the time of COVID. So we want people to look at this problem seriously, and we want to come up with collective solutions. So that call actually got attention from other associations and from global business as well, and also from CSOs. So building on this momentum and based on the recommendations of the joint statement in 2021, the STAR Network and our partners, including IAF, BBI, and also, for instance, GIZ, we have a group of GIZ representatives over there. Yeah. So we jointly started this STTI, Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative. So the project was initiated to contribute to a I will still quote a more, it's from our position paper, a more equal distribution of due diligence responsibility and the cost through fair purchasing practices, aligning and streamlining manufacturers' positions and expectations on purchasing practices. So it's a group call from a group of associates representing I would say at least 60 or 70% of the global tech garment trade. So the way we are doing this is to actually we want to on the brands and buyers to work with us actually to try to solve the challenge we face together. So we need some kind of power to talk with this even sometimes very powerful brands. So that's why we have to unite together. I mean, the manufacturer associations. So all the association from this key apparel sourcing countries, we come together and come up with this initiative, and we speak with a united voice and also with the same purpose. So the underlying philosophy or argument we are using here is the commercial compliance, because as everyone here understands, in the past 30 years, the buyers and brands come to us and tell us you have to be, socially responsible. So you have to be socially compliant. Okay, we understand that, but the lessons we learned from the COVID and also from other instances tell us that the commercial compliance of our business partners is actually the foundation for us to be more responsible, for us to be able to be responsible. So that's the terminology we are using, and also the foundation we are building on all the activities. It's commercial compliance for both sides, not just for suppliers, but more for the buyer and the brands. So we come up with a white paper. You can find it very easily online, and one of the most important aspects or contribution we make in that white paper is actually a set of recommendations, key recommendations. I still remember, okay, allow me a little bit more time. I still remember, when we developed these recommendations, initially we used the term red lines. Yeah, you can see how we actually look so serious at these items, these recommendations. But finally, some friends, some colleagues said this is too confrontational. It's like we are going to fight with somebody. Red lines. You cannot step out of this. So we changed that terminology into, I said, key recommendations. But the key recommendations are very fundamental for us. Okay, it's actually the bottom line for us. I would like to really offer two examples. Like first, payment terms may not exceed 60 days, or the number of days that is customary between a buyer and the supplier, whichever is shorter. If it's 45, if it's 30, if it's 3 days, better. Yep. And secondly, all prices need to cover all costs of compliance production and allow for a reasonable and sustained supplier profit. Yeah. It's a set of recommendation. I'm just offering two examples of things like this. We think this is so fundamental, for both sides to have a sustainable and also, continuous business. So now we call on the global brands and the retailers really to work with us, commit to, this shared understanding of what the responsible purchases is, and to really work together as a group to co-create global and also industry-wide consensus and solutions. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And those recommendations sound very logical. and it sounds like a good initiative. I think what is particularly good is that the way you are working together with multiple industry associations from different countries. Because what we often, of course, see is that there's a bit of a race to the bottom amongst producing countries. And this way you are kind of joining hands and joining forces with these kind of very clear recommendations. And these are the types of recommendations that could also be coming into contracts, which brings me to you, Sarah Dadush, from the Rutgers Law School, sorry, because you are working on responsible contracts. And so we are very interested to hear from you how those could be helpful in this discussion and how maybe responsible contracts could support a fairer distribution of costs across the different supply chain actors. So Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I'll be speaking in my capacity as a law professor, but also as the director of our very recently launched Responsible Contracting Project, which develops practical contractual tools to improve human rights in supply chains. And I thought I'd just begin by a little bit interrogating the terminology. So, you know, we were sort of using the word cascading like it was a little bit of a bad word. And I'm actually not sure it is. It may actually be what we want, because when I think of cascading, I think of an ongoing flow of water that may be going down, but it is continuous. It is non-stop. Everybody always has responsibility all the time, including for covering the costs associated with human rights due diligence. I think what we're really worried about is a shifting of responsibility, which tends to be very characteristic of many supply contracts, where essentially the buyer kind of turns on the responsibility water tap, fills up the supplier's cup with that water, and then turns off the tap and carries on. And that's really the shifting problem that we're concerned about. And I think that gets us to from my perspective, the sort of #1 key ingredient of human rights due diligence aligned contracting, which builds very much on what Dr. Liang was saying, which is that responsibility for upholding human rights in supply chains should be shared between buyers and suppliers throughout the life of their relationship. And they should be shared in all aspects of supply chain management, including in the contract. And to get, I was like, I can't be over
Ignore
yet.
it.
So to get to that sort of key shared responsibility ingredient, and to get that key ingredient into the HRDD mix, we need a fundamental shift that I've heard a few times mentioned throughout our time together this week, which is a shift from an approach of managing risk that goes from an approach of managing company risk to an approach of managing human rights risks, right? That really centers human rights risk management. Did the lights just get a lot brighter?
Yeah, we're now really in the spotlight, which is
right. So we really need this sort of fundamental shift to go toward centering human rights risk management, because really, depending on which approach you choose, whether you're managing company risk or you're managing human rights risk, that is going to produce a very different buyer-supplier relationship. It's also going to produce a very different supply contract. So if you're centering, company risk management, you're going to get contracts that make the supplier solely responsible for upholding human rights standards. You're going to get representations and warranties and promises by suppliers that they are in full compliance with the buyer's code of conduct. You're going to get contracts that put all the costs for that compliance on the supplier. And if anything goes wrong, those contracts are going to say that only the supplier is to blame, even if the buyer's own purchasing practices contributed to the violation of the buyer's own code of conduct. And if a bad thing happens, also the buyer is typically able to exit the contract immediately without giving much, if any, time to the supplier to cure the problem, and without addressing the grievances of the victims, right? Without remediating the human rights aspects of the contractual violation. And lastly, if you have this sort of company risk management at the center, you also have quite penalizing damages on the other side of a supplier breach. Whereas if you have a human rights management centered approach, you are more likely to have a contract that would say both parties share responsibility for upholding human rights. Both parties will carry out ongoing, in cooperation, human rights due diligence. You'll have contracts that at least acknowledge that the buyer's purchasing practices have an impact on the human rights outcomes of the contract, and that commit the buyer to supporting the supplier's own HRDD performance. And that can include, right, providing assistance and supporting, cost sharing between buyer and supplier. And lastly, you would have a contract that prioritizes human rights remediation over traditional contract remedies like exit and then financial damages. So this sort of shared responsibility, human rights centered approach is, to my mind, the sort of key ingredient of successfully integrating and implementing human rights due diligence principles in your contracts and in your supply chains.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Well, the lights went on. So, Michael, you already said that you are probably the most nervous person in this panel. So the spotlights, of course, are on you, but also from the other panelists, like to hear what if you have any comments on what you've heard so far. But particularly, of course, for you, Michael, if you hear these kind of things, like the recommendations from the STTI or these points that are mentioned here in responsible contracting, is that something that you are already using, or that you recognize, or that you could work with?
Yeah, thanks, Joris. And I'm tempted to crack a bad joke and say the conversation's becoming more illuminating as it goes on. So look, I think everything that we hear is common sense, right? There's no question about that. I think the bigger question is how do we create a different incentive system in order to ensure better compliance with these common sense ideas, right? So, for example, just, to be very simplistic about it, so let's say a brand does the right thing, incurs extra costs. Well, what are investors going to say about that? Are you going to get downgraded because your margin got smaller? Are you going to have to put your prices up for consumers? Will your market share drop? So we really need to look at how do we incentivize the whole system and not just those individual brands who are outliers. But I would say, stepping back a little bit, the days of a brand, in my opinion, being able to point to a supplier when something goes wrong and says, oh, that's his fault. If those days are not over, they're coming to an end, right? Because I think there's much more understanding. And I think, there've been a lot of COVID babies, real and metaphorical, but I think one of the things in COVID, it led to a much better and deeper understanding of the supply chain with journalists, with investors, and even with consumers at large. So I think people are rightly identifying where the power lies in the supply chain, and they're pointing at the individual or the company that has that power and says, well, what are you going to do about this problem here? Second, I think, and particularly in Europe, but fashion is becoming a regulated industry, right? We can talk about HRDD, we can talk about product claims, we can talk about reporting requirements, but if you take a step back, we're basically moving into being a regulated space like never before. And I think the whole industry has to adjust that mindset and not just look at these things that are coming down the line as individual compliance mechanisms with which one has to adhere to. I think it's a much broader conversation. And as a fashion industry at large, we have to recognize that we no longer are going to be able to get someone else to sign an indemnification contract and we point and say, oh, that wasn't us, that was them, because we're being caught by this broader piece of regulation. And then the third point I'd make just on this is a bit of a cautionary tale. And I can talk about this now because it's public. It was in The Guardian maybe 2 weeks ago. But we have a licensee. The licensee went into a contract in Haiti For a very small number of garments, we estimated we were less than 1% of production. For whatever reason, the factory closed down. The owner of the factory absconded, and not unusually, workers were left owing money for their pension fund, for wages that were owed, and for severance. So we sat down with the trade unions in Haiti, with the Employers Association, and with Workers' Rights Consortium, a US-based NGO, and worked out the liability, and it was $1 million. And we took a decision as a brand, given that the employer, the supplier, was no longer on the premises, they'd exited stage left, we couldn't locate them. We took a decision that we had to pay it. So we put together a package. We spoke to our licensee, but we paid most of the money, and we cut a check for $1 million. And then myself and my colleague Meghna, who's here, spent much of the last couple of months figuring out how to get that money safely to workers or former workers in conditions where, you know, the gangs are essentially running the country, and if it broke publicly, that there's $1 million being distributed in Haiti, it would have caused another problem, and that would have been, you know, both safety and reputational related. But there's a situation whereby, you know, we had someone on our behalf put in a very small order, and suddenly, you know, we feel that it's the right thing to do to pay $1 million. And look, the Guardian article is very nice. It says very nice things about PBH. But ultimately, this is going to happen again and again and again if you don't do your upfront work. And the best way to do your upfront work is to find strategic partners who you can work with, like Shahi, for example, where we do a lot of collaboration. We sit down at the end, and everything from sustainability to human rights, etc. We sit down and try to go through that together. And I think that's got to be the way forward, particularly if you want to be an aspirational brand, because right now we're talking about regulators, but it's going to be going, and already has, to a great degree, of investors. And the kind of questions I'm being asked by investors about living wage is markedly different to those questions 2 years ago. They are much more pointed, they are much more exact, and they are running out of patience. And eventually it'll get to consumers. So if you want to be an aspirational brand and you want to align with the values of the people to whom you're trying to sell, particularly these tiresome young people who apparently seem to have all the money, you have to get your house in order, because it's no longer going to be a reputational risk. It's going to be a business and regulatory risk if you don't.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And I think it's, of course, a really good example of how a brand is taking responsibility, and maybe even beyond what is expected of you, given your small percentage of the production in that particular factory. But it is indeed something that then sort of comes at the end, whereby you take that responsibility. So those are a couple of good examples. But I would like to sort of discuss now a little bit more, how can you go to the how, but also a little bit about the challenges and the limitations, because we hear all these good examples. You have all these good recommendations. You are talking about contracts. You gave a lot of good examples. But of course, the reality is that there are, in the garment and textile industry, still a lot of challenges and a lot of limitations to make this possible. So I would like to hear from you. On the one hand, do you see what kind of mechanisms, or what kind of sort of more long-term and sustainable buyer-supplier collaboration can we think of to make sure that this is becoming more of a systemic issue, to ensure that there's a good distribution of cost and responsibilities between buyers and suppliers? And maybe also think about what are the limitations or challenges that we may be faced in light of the particular characteristics of this industry. And may I start with you, Anand?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to start with, just maybe some critical feedback, some challenges that remain with, I think, many suppliers. On the contract piece, I think everything that's been shared is, very accurate, and I agree with a lot, pretty much everything that's been said. One challenge, I think, with contracts as well, that hasn't come up yet is has to do with penalties. So, for example, if we, ship an order late, or there's quality issues, obviously there's certain penalties or certain refunds. However, if there's order cancellations, that's not the same case. So any other purchase you make in any other sector, if you cancel, last minute or even within a certain time period, there's a certain compensation at least that would be given, which isn't the case for us, which I think is quite odd and, I feel like could be addressed. And then in terms of, the challenges of buyer-supplier relations, I guess to put it sort of simply, there's many things that our, customers would rely on, like brands and retailers rely on their supply chain to achieve a lot of their sustainability goals. So if you're talking about, for example, environmental goals, most of the footprint is in the factories. So, any brand that says they want to achieve a certain level of renewable energy or carbon emissions, their supply chain partners are the ones who have to make the investments, or any other, similar sustainability goal. And I think that in some sense, factories have, when factories do that, obviously it benefits all, the workers, it benefits the factories, the environment, a lot of different people. But then when there are, challenges or failures, for example, labor challenges or other issues, the traditional or, common response can be for, brands or retailers to sort of distance themselves from these issues. I think that's changing. And I think the optimistic view is, what Michael had shared, which I agree with, and I've seen a lot as well. But maybe the common complaint is that where, successes of a factory become brand achievements, but failures become, points of kind of distancing, which I think, should definitely change, because one of the ways that I think Shahi motivates ourselves to really continue to improve is we see ourselves as an extension of our customers. So when any of our customers puts out an ambitious goal, it gives us an opportunity to think about, okay, how do we make sure that happens? And so, yeah, I think that's the right mindset, but it requires a similar mentality, I think, from both sides.
Thanks a lot. So I think that's an interesting point that you're making, that it's not just about the sharing of the responsibilities and the sharing of the cost, but also the sharing of the successes and any failures or challenges that may come up, that need to be also shared amongst buyers and suppliers. So Dr. Lian, from your perspective, obviously you have the SCTI recommendations, and we've heard already some comments saying that those are quite straightforward and very logical. They kind of make a lot of sense, but apparently they are still needed to have these recommendations, and you have this whole network is apparently needed. So why is that needed? What are, from your perspective, the key challenges and limitations to better buyer-supplier division of responsibilities and costs?
Well, let me first really, I would like to call your attention that we are not creating some kind of fight or battle between brands and suppliers. We are not trying to really set up a wall somewhere along the supply chain that this is us, that's them. We are not creating such kind of modalities. We really want everyone on our supply chain to know we are a group. We are together. Everybody's benefit is reliant on depending on other people's livelihoods. It's just so simple. So we have all these recommendations as I mentioned, but in the end, they need to be implemented. This recommendation needs to be implemented and need to be realized. So we have several strategies to implement this. Number one, we also talk to individual brands. Some are here actually today. But we, as I said, we want to create some kind of collective solution. So the most important, engagement strategy for STDI is actually to talk to the multi-stakeholder, initiatives like SAC and also like the common framework. They are, associations or alliance of brands and buyers. So we want them to really integrate our recommendations into their principles norms, their standards, especially their measuring systems, how to measure the progress made by their members. So for instance, so far, the Saks brand and retailer module, our BRM, they have integrated in a way, incorporated 80% of our recommendations in the, this is 80% is actually, it's about the common framework, because common frameworks, they have 5 principles, and so far they recognized 80% of recommendations within this, their practices. So things like this, we work with collective membership and groups like SAC and the common framework. And this also we need to set up mechanisms and systems to effective changes. So, for instance, we have currently 2 very important activities going on. One is the learning and the implementation community. We call it LIC, which is a dialogue platform for brands and buyers and for buyers and suppliers. We jointly discuss, our recommendations and mutual challenges together, so that we'll not create, 2 forums of discussions. Yeah, we have to set up, sit it together, and we want them to understand our concerns, and we want them to really, come up and embrace the recommendations we made. And secondly, we are also trying to be a little bit more, aggressive, if I can use this term, because there's a pilot project we are working with ACT. It's about the complaint mechanism for manufacturers. Once they feel they have different opinions about certain issues with their buyers, they can raise complaints to the about the purchasing commitments and practices. So through this channel, we hope that it's not just about talk, okay, and that will actually drive real changes, and also will create joint learning opportunities. So it's really we just started, and we have to coordinate between so many associations, as I said, 14, 15 now, from 2 or 3 continents, representing over, as I said, 60–70% of world's garment trade. And I have to say that we, as a group, as CTI, we have our fundamental, request as the key recommendations. But in the end, we also need commitment from the other side. I don't want to say the other party, because we are together. So we are trying to create such kind of systems to really, engage with brands and also the groups of brands to facilitate, systemic change. Yeah. So we know that it's not easy. Yeah, but we believe this is the only way that can actually change the whole system. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. And I think it makes total sense, of course, to work with an organization like ACT with their focus on purchasing practices. At the same time, not all brands are participating in ACT. So that, of course, represents a challenge. Like, how do you deal with brands who are not committing to these kind of purchasing practices? And do they then follow those recommendations? Are they even aware that these recommendations are issued? Do you reach out to many brands with these kind of suggestions?
Well, I think we are trying very hard to promote this SCTI initiative and also our recommendations. This is the soft way, but we are also trying really to talk with brands and their associations about okay, this needs to be happening already, and somebody needs to really lead this way. Yeah. So and also use the case from our Indian friends again, because we hope that also, for instance, the policymakers can really step up there's a due diligence law making in many countries. Okay, it seems that the human rights and environmental risks about it's more about the supplier world. Yeah, but I hope these laws can also have a have another point of view, looking at
The
practices.
legislation. Yeah.
So what about the penalty for, unnoticed cancellation of dollars? Yeah, because that will create a very huge disability, instability along supply chain, and that will actually influence the livelihood and rights of millions of workers in our world. Yeah.
Well, I think also forums like these are, of course, important in order to have these discussions, to raise more awareness about these kind of recommendations, and also that organizations from production countries are actually participating in this whole debate.
Yes.
So that's why I think it's good that we are here
So
having
yes,
these discussions. Yes,
Actually,
go ahead.
sorry. Actually, OECD and ILO, they are actually sitting on at the advisory board of our initiative.
Okay,
Yes,
very good.
so,
Yeah, great. So, Sarah, what do you see as the key sort of challenges and limitations to implementing all your great ideas?
Well, I'm going to, focus a little bit more on contracts because that's my jam. But, I think, one big limitation is actually practical, that we're just not, as lawyers or not lawyers that are working with contracts, particularly well equipped or used to integrating human rights into contracts, or to do this very important linking that Dr. Lang was talking about between commercial practices and social or human rights performance. This idea of commercial compliance, I think, is really key. And we don't really know how to translate that into contracts. So that's part of our effort, is to provide tools to do that. And I think it's really necessary because, there's like a practical limitation that I'm drawing attention to, but it is very much a child of the sort of still ongoing mentality of centering company risk over human rights risk. And while I agree, with Michael, that we're sort of seeing a movement in the right direction as far as regulating fashion or making fashion a regulated area, I'm not sure that we've seen the end of the days where buyers are looking to shift the responsibility onto their suppliers. I just heard yesterday from a new colleague that apparently with the enactment of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the States, US companies that might see their goods being seized at the border as a result of this are contractualizing an obligation for the supplier to pay all penalties related to problems with the new act. So, I mean, I think the impulse remains very strong to have that shifting. But I also agree that with the human rights due diligence legislation, we have like a vastly different sort of conversation that is afoot. And so the role the contracts have to play in here is also really vital, because contracts are like the legal links in the supply chain, right? So if you're wanting to really integrate HRDD into your supply chains, contracts are a really good place to look. And what we discussed actually in our side session, if anybody wants to look at what happened on Wednesday, is that under the French law, the German law, and the draft CS3D, it is not a given that companies are going to be able to just have one-sided contracts and satisfy the new legal requirements. It is not a given that they're going to be able to just include certain contractual clauses and be shielded from liability if something bad happens and an injury persists. So my advice to companies would be, and to suppliers that are either in scope for these new legislations themselves, or supplying companies that are in scope for the new laws, is to really take the time to examine your contracts and, take our tools or tools developed by our friends and upgrade them to make them more come in service of human rights due diligence.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And interesting example that you give, whereby this new legislation in the US is giving a sort of adverse impulse to the whole issue, instead of promoting more responsible contracting. So that's definitely something to watch out for. And like you say, the German due diligence legislation already has these kind of provisions, and the upcoming EU legislation probably will also have provisions to ensure a certain level of responsible purchasing. Michael, I thought you wanted to say something, and after that I would like to ask the audience, also the online audience, if there's any questions coming up. But Michael, you wanted to comment, right?
Yeah, just a couple of quick, and I'll keep it very, very brief, but I'm minded of, the points that Anant and Dr. Liang made around an us and them mentality. It's like, I'm a bit of a football fan, and it's like, you support a team and the team wins a game and someone says, how did the game go? We won, we won. The team loses. How did the game go? They lost. So I think we have to get away from that sort of mentality. The other point I'd make, I agree with every word Sarah says, and for those that aren't aware with the incredible work Sarah's doing in contracts, I would strongly advise you to go look it up. It's phenomenal stuff. But I think contract reform is necessary but not sufficient, right? So the advice I would give, and the advice I do give regularly to other brands, is you have to get comfortable pooling your sovereignty, and then you have to be prepared to live your values, right? So what do I mean by those two things? So if you look at the Accord, or we're also a signatory member of ACT, that's a governance process that has, ACT has Industrial Global Union there, the Accord has Industrial and Uni, the RSC has the BGMEA, I see the Honourable President over there. So you have to recognize that as a brand, you're not going to get your own way all the time. You're not going to be able to dictate in those forums. And, I've been involved in 3 different ways in Accord governance since 2013. It is messy, but it is worth it, because what you come out with on the other side is much more sustainable. And then the other point I'd make, and this might be a little controversial, and I hope I have a job after I say this, but you have to live your values. And what I mean by that is, look, I'm in a lot of rooms with a lot of retailers, a lot of suppliers, and there might be, for example, a freedom of association request, and brands and retailers will make their views known. But speaking, if I may, frankly and freely, if I'm a supplier and I'm sitting there and I'm listening to a brand or retailer telling me, you have to talk to the union, you have to let them in the factory, you have to respect freedom of association, and I know that in its home country, that brand and retailer is viciously anti-union, I'm going to look at him and say, give me a break. So I actually think, if you're going to get down this route, you have to be authentic, because inauthenticity will kill you with the regulator and will kill you with consumers.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Now I'd like to, I see some hands, but I also want to check if there's any questions online. So let's first hear from the back if there's any questions from the online audience, and then I saw already some hands up. So we'll have a lively discussion here as well.
Indeed, we have actually quite a number of questions from the folks online. Great discussion, lots of compliments, high interest in the white paper from Syntac. Let me just maybe start with 2 general questions. One, do we need a labeling scheme for human rights at a product level? Really, the coming from this understanding that it's really almost impossible to get the information of human rights violations when making clothes. So that question. And then the one that's a little bit more provocative from a lawyer saying, our shareholders, who are usually investment funds, are we expected to reduce profits in order to implement a more sustainable value chain? So provocative question there.
Very provocative.
And then there was a lot of questions around the human rights contract, Sarah. I think folks really appreciated your analogy. One particular question, very specific on order guarantees, and could you share a little bit more on what that looks like in practice? Let me just see, let me scroll down. I think we can keep it at that. We've got a couple more other questions.
Maybe
but we
that's
can
enough
come
for
back.
now.
Yeah.
So anybody particularly inclined to answer any of these questions? Sarah, I can see that you are very keen. What about what was it? How did they call it?
think
Human rights labeling?
Oh, on the labeling. I think other people may have more thoughts on the labeling than me, but yeah, I mean, I think what that really gets at is disclosure, right? And consumer information. That's why you would want the labeling. And I think there are a lot of labels out in the world, and consumers are often sort of overwhelmed by the labeling. And to my mind, a more effective system is to actually just regulate the human rights performance of supply chains through something like mandatory human rights due diligence legislation. I would take that over a certification really any day of the week. Just as far as the guarantee question, I think what that is asking is what do contracts typically contain? It will typically be something like a representation or a warranty by a supplier that it is in full compliance and will always be in full compliance with the buyer's code of conduct. So that is typically, to the extent that human rights are included in contracts, it's usually in this way. And the deficiency of that is that it's basically asking the supplier to make an impossible promise, or a promise that's impossible to keep, because the likelihood that a supply chain would be entirely pristine or entirely free of human rights issues is very, very low. And it often would put the supplier in breach of contract on day one of the contract. And it sort of has, right, the emphasis is on compliance and sort of strict liability, whereas what you get from a human rights due diligence approach is not so much an emphasis on perfection, but an emphasis on prevention, right? Take all the measures that you need to take to figure out what's going on in your supply chain, and then mitigate and prevent those risks from graduating into harm.
Yeah, I also think that if you you have to avoid that there's some sort of like an adverse incentive to hide things, just because then immediately as something pops up, you are in breach of the contract. We see that a lot with, for example, subcontracting, which we all know is happening a lot, and at the same time. There's quite strict rules from some brands that make the suppliers try to hide that even more than show that and discuss how to resolve that. Ms. Lian, you wanted to comment on the human rights labeling, and then I wanted to ask maybe Michael or Anand to maybe comment on the question about the do we have to accept lower profits, and how do investors look at that? And then we turn to the live audience here.
Well, I think people need, I can fully understand people need very simple solutions. Okay, like a label telling you you are buying a good product. You can sleep very well tonight. Yeah. But we have, we have just numerous cases telling us that, label is like a snapshot. Okay. At a certain moment, for some people, okay, you are totally fine today, but tomorrow maybe you will get some kind of health conditions. So, can we to what extent can we guarantee that the human rights condition will always be so fine that can keep you always smile? So I don't think this will solve the problem, but I can fully understand everyone needs some kind of simple and a direct solution.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's see what questions we have from the audience. There's a gentleman over there. And there's a gentleman over there. Oh, sorry, yeah. Thank you. So,
Yeah.
can we lower some profits, please? Just for the sake of compliance.
Let me
Thanks for the
first of all,
reminder.
yeah, let me first of all thank the hecklers in the room for reminding the moderator about the profit question. So the question was, will we have to reduce profits? And my honest answer is I don't know, right? But I think not necessarily. Because if you've got you know, better planning, if you've got less discounting, that enables the supplier to plan for, you know, less increased overtime. If you get closer to the consumer, you can plan much better. You don't have to sell your clothes at a reduced cost. There's less airing necessary, so you don't have to put things on a plane, so you can actually manage your costs a lot more. So I do think there's a lot around the purchasing practices that we can do. My own view, however, is that, and this is a personal view, I think ultimately, I think brands have to pay more for the clothes that they're buying. I think that's indisputable. And I think the question becomes, how do we do it together? Because, or how do we at least get a critical mass to move in that direction? Because the brands that are the first movers on that by a segment of the investment community will be penalized. There's no question about that. Share price drops, then you're susceptible to a takeover and you get bought by a brand that doesn't share those values, and we're back into the cycle. So we've got to figure out a way how to do it together and how to build that incentive system.
Thanks. Anand, you wanted to comment on that as well?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to answer this just by saying that I think that when I talk to our factory teams, the rising costs of new compliances and new standards is definitely a challenge. And I kind of referenced to this in, my earlier response. When we're costing out a product, we may, we'll look at the minutes required to make it. We may account for some, machine breakdown time, but we don't account for the time that the human resource time going into managing the compliance and, the workers' time also that sometimes is required. So as those requirements increase, there's more and more of a squeeze that's unaccounted for, and that can lead to, a lot of tension in different ways. So that's definitely there on one side. But the other, perspective that I have is, aside from my role at Shahi, I'm also one of the co-founders of a labor innovation lab. And one of the things we look at is how factories and how companies can invest in, the well-being of their workforce in a way that's good for them. What are the business incentives for investing in the well-being of your workforce? And we found that there are several programs. And without going into details, broadly, I could say that, at a factory, at one of Shahi's factories, one of the big problems we face is high attrition. So there's a huge churn. Workers are leaving at really high rates. And this is common, I think, in the garment sector in India in general. So that means that, that has a cost implication. And so if there's things that are affecting, their work experience that we can actually improve, whatever cost that might be, it would reduce the cost of attrition and perhaps pay for itself. And we've seen that happen through various different programs, which, I'm happy to talk to people about afterwards.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there's quite often also a business case to make for social and environmental compliance. But yeah, there's also, of course, a cost involved in some cases. Gentleman over there.
The question is a good follow-up to this. So David from Public Eye and Clean Clothes Campaign. Anand, just to make it quite specific, if at Shahi, the lowest wages would be tripled in order to reach living wages, what your customers actually say they want, what would you need from your buyers to do it in terms of prices, in terms of contracts, in terms of relationships? Just to make it clear how the cost of this, according to you, should be shared. And the follow-up question to Michael is obvious. Would you do it?
Okay, go ahead, Anand.
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. Thank you. So I could share some kind of information about costing in general. So at Shahi, 30% of our cost is wages. And so we employ, as I mentioned, a large workforce. So if you're talking about doubling or tripling that, and you operate on, single digit margins, that not only erases your margin, but actually puts you in losses. So the question is then, how do we achieve living wages? I don't actually know how we achieve it, but I think that one of the ways is first looking at like how much could a factory pay more than what we're currently paying, where it wouldn't put them in losses. So let's say, we're paying some amount right now, the living wage is double that. Maybe there's a number in between. We can reach to that where it could actually be profitable to pay more. And in the field of economics, they call it the efficiency wage. I think it's something that could be studied and explored. But at the end of the day, to reach that full amount, there's probably a role for, brands and retailers. There's probably a role for all of us as consumers. The cost of clothing keeps going down, even though all the other costs involved continue to rise, including wage costs. So there's probably a little bit everyone has to contribute. It's not clear what the breakup is, for each stakeholder.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the follow-up question to Michael, are you willing to cough it up?
Personally, so look, I would point to the fact that, and I don't want to answer this in an abstract way, so I'm going to give a specific example, right? I think ACT is the best model that's out there, right? So I think it's imperfect, but it's like democracy, right? It's the worst system except for all the others, right? So it's, in my view, what ACT does is it's quite simple, and I think the focus on purchasing practices, a bit like contracts. I think purchasing practices are necessary but insufficient. But what ACT does fundamentally is recognizes the role of the brand, right, in the employment relationship between the supplier and the employee. And for those who don't know, by the way, PVH is my first ever corporate job, as you can see by the way I speak sometimes. But I come from a background of
And your last?
Yeah. I may be changing my LinkedIn profile to open to work. But my background, I worked for the labor movement for about 23 years. I was a trade union negotiator, and I'm a trade union lawyer. That's my background. And I think what ACT properly did was recognize that the brands are the power in the room that's not sitting at the table, right? So I can talk publicly about maybe 80% of this work, but in Ethiopia, we got extremely close to actually getting a sector-wide CBA. We had the government on board, we had the ILO on board, we had the suppliers on board, and we were getting the unions on board. The unions since, by the way, have gotten access to every single factory at Hawassa Industrial Park. They have shop stewards in place. Those shop stewards are recognized, really progressive stuff. And then what we actually did is we did outreach to the brands, and I'm looking at my good friend Tobias here from H&M. He and I did a lot of marching together in Ethiopia, but we got brands on board, including non-signatory brands, and Industrial was hugely helpful in this in terms of having the flexibility. So brands that had not signed ACT had agreed that whatever came out of the collective bargaining negotiations, they would actually also implement with their suppliers. And those brands made up 70% of the export-led garment sector. And the last foreign trip I did just before COVID was to Addis Ababa, where we had a full day convened by the ILO with the government there, with the US government in participation, DOL, etc. And I'm not trying to be, naive, but we came this close to getting it done. And then we had COVID hit, which put a wobble in, and then we had the war in Tigray, which kind of took over everything. So I think where we have to get to is a point in a country where we can demonstrate that brands are willing to weigh in and support industry-wide collective bargaining that delivers changes in how brands operate, how brands pay, the relationship with the suppliers, and then tracks how that additional revenue gets through to workers. I think the brands that are signatories of ACT have absolutely demonstrated their commitment to that. But it goes back to the point earlier that Yora said, right now we're 19 brands. We're not that many. You look at the Accord, we had 220 brands, right? So we have to convince more brands to join ACT and convince those brands that collective bargaining is not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing to sign something with Industrial to get it done. So I definitely think there's a pathway there, but it's not simple, it's not straightforward, but PVH for one is committed.
Thank you, Michael. We have a couple of minutes left, about 10 minutes. A gentleman over there from the BGMEA, I gather.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Sean. I'm a manufacturer from Bangladesh as well as a BGMA member. So a couple of questions. First of all, really want to touch upon the accord a little bit first. It worked out wonderfully. It's one of the example of how collaborative approach between a supplier and the buyers together and the regulatory body in the government can really make a tremendous difference, and how much progress we have made since 2013 to now. We have become one of the safest place to produce garments from electrical health and all structural safety. If you look at the similar approach that we have taken along the way we were going with the structural and safety approach, is we understood that environmental requirement is one of the biggest requirement it's coming up. So we also took the challenge and kind of lead the way. Our president is sitting right here on the environmental sustainability part from all aspects. Bangladesh is very, Bangladesh industry, the garments industry, where it's very highly washed garments. We produce a lot of garments that's very heavily washed. So we have done a lot of innovation on washes. We have done a lot of innovation on rainwater harvesting. So overall, the USGBC certification on the lead platinum, as you know, the highest number of factories in the world exist there. So without flagging from the brand, there are a couple of other things, and brand and the factories and Bangladesh itself is a couple of things I want to just point out about the collaboration. You heard our colleague Najma speaking here, and she said that a lot of the young women, a lot of young mothers are coming to the factories. Here also the brand and the factories work together. We have a program called Mothers at Work, and that is now going across most of the factories in Bangladesh, where there is a breastfeeding station, also breast collection station, and distributed the breast milk to the child wherever he or she is, and mother might be working in the factory. So here is another example. Then already here mentioned the PACE and HEARS project and a couple of other projects that we all work in, and that made a tremendous difference in the women's working in the garment sector. So there's a lot of positive approach. We hear only wage and profit here, but yes, we are all working towards a better working environment, better sustainable environment. But at the same time, we have to think about efficiency, and we have to think about the rising costs. And all of us have to share some of that, correct, to increase the overall livelihood of ultimately our biggest asset is the people that is working in the factory. That's our biggest asset, not the machines, not anything else. Of course, we are deploying a lot of automated machines to make them more efficient, but at the end of the day, worker has to work at the machines with low turnover rate. That means, less attrition. And Bangladesh doesn't have as much attrition problem as India does, correct? And that is because of a lot of the social indicator that we are able to achieve in the factory. So a lot of good practices that happen in the Bangladesh factories where we are able to achieve that. So I'm not going to take too long, but a couple of things where more collaboration can be done between the brand. Here are a couple of challenges. One is European Union, there is a regulation on the food sector, for example, agricultural sector, where you pay within 90 days of the goods received. Can we do similar type of things, in our garment sector? Number one. Number two is time to time we get into the negotiation table on the minimum wage and living wage. So here, brand never participate. It's normally the government, the factories, and the labor union. Can brand also participate because they're a big stakeholder into the whole thing? So they're also another collaboration that can be done.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. I also have one question there from the lady in the back. And then we are getting close towards the end of the session. So then I would like to ask the panelists to respond to these comments from the gentleman from the BGMEA as well as from Fiona.
It's on? Fiona from Transform Trade, and it's really what I said before, but I'm going to say it in a slightly different way.
Good. Then at least we hear something new.
Let's be honest. Does a retailer or a brand make a single item themselves? Do they find the sewing machine and actually operate it? No. The goods arrive already consumer ready. Essentially, it's a business model where you are guaranteed to make money. Pretty much. Yeah, let's be honest. Price low, put it to the consumers at this price, this is your margin. And it's always in their interest to put it down and to pass the risks on. And my question to you as a panel is, can we genuinely think that begging the brands to do the right thing is going to work? When you make so much money, the brands make so much money with these practices that pass risks on. And the place where it has to be regulated is OECD governments. That's the consumer market. And I would suggest that people start to move perhaps in that direction. That would be my recommendation. And I would welcome collaborating with others to make that happen.
Thank you. So I would like to ask the panelists to consider these comments from the lady over there, as well as from the BGMEA. Maybe Michael, do you want to start? And then as we're getting close to 4 o'clock, and I was informed that we have to be quite strict in time. So this may be the last round. So think about your last final comments that you want to make.
I'll keep this quick. I'll be done by 4:20 at the latest. No, so look, I'm also happy for this to serve as my final comment, if that's helpful.
That's
so,
what I was saying, yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for the clear communication, Joris. Yeah, so look, I think two things. One, I think we are moving to that regulatory environment where regulation is being driven by OECD member governments and regulating back in the supply chain. What I think is absolutely fundamental, however, is that I think the production companies have to also have a seat at that table, right? I don't think OECD countries should set the rules without necessarily bringing in the production countries and hearing a view from them, and it should be a more collaborative effort. And then secondly, just to respond to the Honourable Mr. Sean, and it's great to see you, sir. You're the one Bangladeshi I know with an Irish name, so that's great. But just on the thing about brand participation and minimum wage, that's obviously a statutory decision, and I spent 2.5 years living in Dhaka working for the Accord. And the minimum wage was like, it always was very, very contentious. Everyone knew it was going to be. You just buckled up and you settled in for the ride. But what I would say, however, is that we would be very much open as a collection of brands and as Industrial to having a conversation around ACT, which is a much more collaborative process and one where I think we can foster social dialogue towards, you know, living wages and see how do we square that circle. And then look, the final point I'll make, and I'll leave this as my last comment. So joking aside, I was mandated here by PVH to come up and have an honest conversation, and that's what I try to do, right? So I wrap things up in humor and all that sort of stuff, but I didn't want to just come up here and parrot a typical corporate line, because I think unless we have these honest conversations, we're not going to make any progress, and we have to recognize we're in this together, and it's in everyone's interest that we move to a better world. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Anand, any final thoughts, and also thinking about the questions from the last two interventions?
Yeah, sure. I guess I could respond to your comment just by saying that, you know, I mentioned that Shahi has 50 factories. We understand that in some sense, suppliers take on risk in the current, you know, model of business. But at the same time, you know, I think that everything we've talked about today and a lot of the efforts by people in this room and people watching and working in this space, you know, I appreciate. And I think maybe I could end just by sharing a couple short recommendations. I think that on the buyer-supplier relation topic, so I think that brands can have stronger connects between their sourcing and sustainability teams. That definitely helps, and you know, we see some doing that really well. One way, you know, or that could look like if you're part of BBI, I see Dr. Marsha over here, sharing your scores, getting feedback on that so you can understand how, you know, your purchasing practices may be affecting your suppliers. I think in the medium term, there's a lot of work happening on contracts, and I appreciate all the comments I heard today. I learned a lot. And then I think in the long term, maybe to your, you know, question over there, I think new business models, maybe more, you know, joint venture type approaches to manufacturing. We've experimented a little bit with that with some success. I think better forecasting would help everyone a lot. A lot of, you know, goods get made and don't get sold and get landfilled. So maybe there's an opportunity to, avoid the loss of profits just by working on that issue. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Anand. Very good to have these concrete recommendations. It's very helpful. So, Dr. Lian, any final thoughts from your end?
Well, I think this is it's great discussion. We can see a lot of ideas, great ideas are popping up. I just noticed one very important point. I think that's critical for our discussion. Look at our colleagues from Bangladesh. They are not just business person, they are board members. Look at the PVH and other brands here. Where are their board members? Only these guys can change the world. Who can bring this discussion to these people will benefit the whole world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Lian. And so, Sarah, final thoughts from your end.
Well, first, thank you so much. This has been really amazing. I've learned a lot also. Yeah, I just want to say in response to Fiona's question that, from my perspective as a BHR person who lives in the US, I really look across the pond with massive envy, because of this movement toward mandatory human rights due diligence. I really think it's a deep game changer that can help us, touch on and address all the issues that have been raised here today. And, it doesn't go all the way to filling the sort of purchasing practices gap, but it definitely goes a good part of the way, because there is a clear contemplation of the notion that when a buyer purchasing practices undermines human rights, that can constitute contributing to an adverse impact. And when there is contribution and the harm is unremediated, that can create a liability for the company and for the officers of the company. So I think that, it may not go all the way, but there's a lot here, at least that in the US we can learn from.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And with that, I would like to close this session. I thought it was very lively and, as Michael said, also very honest. And I think it was very good to have all the different parties in the supply chain represented here. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.